On March 17, 2023, at 10:42 in the morning, Trevor Caldwell descended past 1,200 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, 83 miles east of Nassau in the Bahamas, right in the heart of what sailors have called the Devil's Triangle for over a century. Trevor was 39 years old, a technical dive instructor with over 2,100 logged dives, an ex-Navy salvage diver who had worked 14 civilian aircraft recovery operations, and a father fighting for custody of his 7-year-old daughter, Mia. At that depth, in water that should have been empty according to every nautical chart and sonar map of the region, his helmet camera captured something that violated everything he knew about physics, aviation, and the documented history of disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle. A Boeing 737 commercial airliner, approximately 130 feet in length, resting perfectly intact on the seafloor with its landing gear retracted, its windows unbroken, and absolutely no visible signs of violent impact. No aircraft disappearance in the triangle had ever been recorded at this depth, and what Trevor would find inside the fuselage 23 minutes later would prove that this wasn't just a crash site. It was something far more deliberate. Trevor had been diving since he was 16, growing up in Pensacola, Florida, where his father worked as a commercial fisherman and his mother taught marine biology at the local community college. He joined the Navy at 18, spent 6 years in the salvage diving unit, and earned certifications most recreational divers never even heard of: TDI Advanced Trimix, IANTD Cave Diver, and Commercial Surface Supply Qualification. After leaving the service, he built a reputation in the offshore oil industry and specialized recovery operations, the kind of work that paid well but demanded absolute precision and calm under pressure. He was meticulous, careful, and professional. He had never lost a team member on any dive. He had never taken unnecessary risks. And he had seen enough genuine mysteries underwater to know the difference between strange and impossible. His personal life had been rougher than his professional one. Divorced 3 years ago from his wife Rachel, who had remarried and moved to Atlanta, Trevor was fighting a legal battle for joint custody of Mia, who had been diagnosed with anxiety disorder and needed weekly therapy sessions that cost $200 each, sessions his insurance barely covered. The diving work was steady, but the legal fees were crushing. When Cassidy Romano contacted him in early March with an offer of $15,000 for 1 week of documentation work, he knew the money was too high for what she was describing, but he also knew he needed it. Mia's next court evaluation was in 2 months. He had to show financial stability. He took the contract. Cassidy represented a maritime insurance company called Atlantic Maritime Recovery Solutions, a name Trevor had never heard of despite working in the industry for 15 years. She was 45, sharp-spoken, and professional on their video calls, always deflecting when he asked about the company's history or client list. The job seemed straightforward. Document a sonar anomaly that cargo ships had been reporting in a specific coordinate range east of Nassau. Standard survey work. Except Cassidy provided coordinates that were accurate to 6 decimal places, the kind of precision that suggested someone already knew exactly what was down there. When Trevor asked how they obtained such specific data, Cassidy said the information came from proprietary sources and changed the subject. He should have pushed harder. He should have walked away. But $15,000 was $15,000, and Mia's therapy sessions weren't getting cheaper. He hired Quinn as his dive assistant, a 28-year-old former Coast Guard rescue swimmer with solid technical credentials and a calm demeanor that Trevor trusted. They chartered a small research vessel out of Nassau, loaded their equipment, closed-circuit rebreathers, customized tri-mix gas blends for deep diving, an ROV inspection drone, and 4K helmet cameras, and reached the coordinates on March 16th. The sea was calm, visibility at 60 feet, currents minimal. Perfect conditions, almost too perfect. Cassidy had flown in separately and met them at the dock, staying aboard their vessel but keeping mostly to herself, working on a laptop and making encrypted calls that Trevor couldn't overhear. The plan was simple. Survey dive to confirm the anomaly, document with video and sonar imaging, surface, and provide the raw data to Cassidy's company. No salvage, no sample collection, just documentation. Trevor ran through the pre-dive checklist twice, tested all communication systems, and briefed Quinn on emergency protocols. Everything was by the book. Everything was professional. At 10:17 the next morning, they entered the water. 25 minutes later, Trevor saw the wreckage on his sonar screen, and his pulse spiked despite 12 years of training that taught him to stay calm. The shape was unmistakable. This wasn't a geological formation or a sunken ship. This was an intact commercial aircraft, where no aircraft should exist. The descent from 600 feet to 1,247 took Trevor and Quinn 18 minutes, following decompression protocols that Trevor had memorized years ago but still checked on his wrist computer every 30 seconds out of habit, not paranoia. At 600 feet, Trevor noticed the first anomaly. His sonar was showing topography that didn't match the nautical charts Cassidy had provided, charts that supposedly came from NOAA surveys conducted just 8 months earlier. The seafloor contours were wrong by nearly 40 feet in some sections, as if the ocean bottom itself had shifted, or the maps had been deliberately altered. Quinn's voice crackled through the underwater radio system, calm but questioning. "Trevor, you seeing this? My readings don't match the survey data." Trevor confirmed, his own screen showing the same discrepancies, and he made a mental note to ask Cassidy about it when they surfaced, though he suspected she wouldn't give a straight answer. They continued down, their lights cutting through water that was clearer than it had any right to be at this depth. Visibility holding steady at 58 feet, when it should have degraded to 30 or less. At 900 feet, Trevor felt the water temperature change. His dive computer's external sensor showed a spike of 8 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 20 seconds, jumping from 41 degrees to 49 and then settling back to 43. Thermoclines were common in the ocean, layers of water at different temperatures, but they didn't fluctuate like that, oscillating up and down without any current or mixing to explain it. Quinn reported the same reading on his equipment, and Trevor heard the slight edge in his voice, the kind of tension that came from experiencing something that broke the rules without being dangerous enough to abort the dive. They exchanged a glance through their masks, Trevor making the hand signal to continue but stay alert, and they descended another 200 feet, with their lights sweeping the darkness below them, catching occasional glimpses of small fish and drifting particles that looked like marine snow but moved in patterns that seemed almost geometric, almost intentional. At 1,100 feet, Trevor's compass began to spin. Not wildly, not like a malfunction, but in slow, deliberate circles, clockwise for 10 seconds, then counterclockwise for 10 seconds, then stopping and pointing in a direction that was 30 degrees off from magnetic north before starting the pattern again. He tapped it twice, the universal diver signal for equipment check, and Quinn held up his own compass to show the same behavior, both instruments rotating in perfect synchronization like they were being pulled by something invisible and precise. Trevor's pulse remained steady, his breathing controlled, but his mind was cataloging every detail because this was no longer routine documentation work. This was something that would require a detailed report and probably a follow-up investigation by NOAA or the Coast Guard or whoever handled oceanic anomalies that violated basic physics. At 1,200 feet, with 47 feet left to the seafloor according to his depth gauge, Trevor's lights finally caught the shape he had seen on sonar, and his breath stopped for 2 full seconds before training kicked back in and forced him to inhale, forced him to stay professional, forced him to keep descending even though every instinct screamed that what he was seeing couldn't exist. The fuselage was intact. Not pieces scattered across the ocean floor, not a debris field spread over hundreds of yards, but a complete Boeing 737 sitting upright on the seafloor, as if it had been gently placed there by some careful hand, rather than crashing through air and water at terminal velocity. Trevor estimated 130 feet from nose to tail, the standard length for a 737-800 model, and as his lights played across the aluminum skin, he could see paint that was faded and covered in light marine growth but still recognizable, still showing the color scheme of a commercial airline, though the specific company markings were too degraded to read clearly from this distance. Quinn positioned himself on the opposite side of the wreckage, both divers moving slowly around the perimeter, their helmet cameras recording every angle, every detail, every impossible aspect of what they were witnessing. Trevor's training told him to stay objective, to document first and theorize later, but his mind couldn't stop running through the implications, the questions, the violations of everything he knew about aircraft accidents and underwater salvage. The landing gear was retracted. Trevor circled to the belly of the aircraft and confirmed it with his own eyes. The wheels pulled up into the fuselage the way they would be during normal flight, not extended for landing, not torn off by impact, but neatly stowed in their compartments as if the pilots had never attempted an emergency landing, as if the plane had simply transitioned from air to water without any intermediate crash sequence. He moved to the tail section and found the number partially visible under algae and sediment, using his gloved hand to carefully brush away the growth, his camera capturing the alphanumeric sequence. November 381, followed by 2 characters too corroded to read, a United States registration number. He would cross-reference it later with FAA databases, but right now he needed to keep documenting, keep moving, keep his breathing steady even though his mind was racing through scenarios that made less and less sense the more he observed. The windows were intact. Every single passenger window, every cockpit window, all unbroken, all still held in their frames by rubber seals that should have rotted away after any significant time underwater. Trevor brought his light close to one of the cabin windows and peered inside, seeing rows of seats perfectly aligned, overhead compartments closed, no visible damage to the interior structure, and absolutely no bodies, no skeletal remains, no personal belongings floating in the cabin, nothing to indicate that 160 or more people had been on board when this aircraft left the sky. Quinn's voice came through the radio, tight and controlled. "Trevor, something's wrong here." "Really wrong? Planes don't sink like this. You know that. I know that. This is impossible." Trevor acknowledged with a hand signal because he didn't trust his voice to stay steady if he spoke, and he made his way toward the forward fuselage, toward the emergency exit door on the port side, the door that was slightly open, maybe 8 inches, just enough gap to suggest that someone or something had partially unsealed it, had created an entry point that Trevor knew he shouldn't use, but also knew he had to investigate, because Cassidy was paying $15,000, and that money meant custody hearings and therapy sessions and a future for Mia that didn't involve her father being broke and desperate. He approached the door, checked his air supply, confirmed he had 2 hours and 43 minutes remaining on his rebreather, calculated the decompression time for the depth and duration, and made the decision that would change everything. He signaled Quinn to maintain position outside as a safety precaution, standard protocol for confined space penetration, and Quinn moved into position with a clear line of sight to the door. Trevor attached a guideline to the fuselage exterior, a thin rope that would lead him back out if visibility dropped or disorientation set in, and he tested the door's resistance, finding it moved easily, too easily, the hinges functioning as if they had been recently maintained rather than sitting in salt water for years. He pushed it open another 12 inches, enough to fit through with his equipment, and he activated his secondary helmet light for additional illumination. The opening was dark, a rectangle of pure black against the faded aluminum, and Trevor paused for 3 seconds, counted his heartbeats, steady at 72 per minute, controlled his breathing to 14 breaths per minute, and then he pulled himself through the doorway and into the cabin of an aircraft that should not exist. Trevor's lights illuminated a scene that his brain refused to process correctly for the first 5 seconds. A tableau so perfectly preserved that it looked like a museum exhibit rather than the interior of a sunken aircraft. The passenger cabin stretched ahead of him in rows of blue fabric seats, 26 rows based on what he could see before the curve of the fuselage blocked his view, and every seat was perfectly aligned, backs upright, tray tables stowed, overhead compartments closed with their latches still engaged. His helmet camera swept across the port side and recorded details that made no physical sense. A coffee cup still secured in the tray holder on seat 7A by what looked like dried residue creating suction. A laptop computer closed on seat 12C. A magazine spread open across the armrest of seat 14C, showing an advertisement for luxury watches, and a carry-on bag visible through the gap in an overhead bin with clothing still neatly folded inside. There were no bodies. Trevor moved down the center aisle, his fins brushing the carpet that should have been rotted and disintegrated, but instead showed only light sediment, and he counted empty seats, one after another, 167 passenger positions with absolutely zero human remains. No bones, no clothing, no personal items in the seats themselves, as if every passenger had simply stood up and walked away mid-flight, taking nothing with them, leaving behind a perfectly organized cabin that violated every principle of aviation accidents Trevor had studied during his Navy salvage training. The impossibility of it pressed against his thoughts like physical weight. Aircraft don't sink intact. The impact with water at any speed above 80 miles per hour tears fuselages apart, separates wings from bodies, shatters windows, floods cabins violently, and scatters debris across massive search areas. Trevor had seen it 14 times in his career, had documented the aftermath of controlled water landings and catastrophic crashes, and every single one had left a debris field, had left bodies, had left evidence of the violence involved in transitioning from air to ocean. But this aircraft showed none of that. The emergency oxygen masks were still stowed in their overhead panels, not deployed. The emergency exit door instructions were still sealed in their plastic sleeves, not torn or faded. The window shades were a mix of up and down positions, as if passengers had been adjusting them for comfort during a routine flight. Trevor photographed everything, his camera capturing images that he knew would be analyzed and questioned and possibly dismissed as fabricated because they were too clean, too organized, too impossible to be real. He moved forward through the cabin, checking seat pockets and finding boarding passes, safety cards, air sickness bags still neatly folded, and in seat 9A he found a smartphone, an iPhone model that he recognized as relatively recent, maybe 2 or 3 years old, sitting in the pocket as if someone had just slid it there intending to retrieve it later. He carefully extracted it with his gloved hand, knowing the salt water would have destroyed any electronics, but documenting its presence because it was another piece of the impossible puzzle. The screen was dark, the charging port corroded, but the casing was intact, and he could see a small sticker on the back showing a family photo. 3 people smiling at a beach, too blurred under the protective case to make out faces, but clear enough to know this had belonged to someone with a life, with connections, with people who probably spent months searching for answers that never came. Trevor reached the forward galley area where flight attendants would have prepared drinks and meals, and found the compartments organized with cups still stacked, napkins in their dispensers, and a drawer partially open containing what looked like crew documentation and emergency procedure cards. He moved past the galley to the cockpit door, a reinforced barrier that had been standard on commercial aircraft since 2001, and found it closed with the locking mechanism engaged from the inside, exactly as protocol required during flight. He tried the handle and confirmed it was secure, then retrieved the small pry bar from his equipment kit, a tool designed for opening seized hatches and panels during salvage operations, and positioned it against the doorframe. He applied steady pressure, feeling the mechanism resist and then give way with a metallic snap that echoed through the flooded cabin, and the door swung inward, revealing the cockpit, 2 seats positioned side by side facing instrument panels that still showed indicators and switches and controls that would never function again, but remained eerily intact, frozen in their final positions. The pilot and co-pilot seats were empty, seat belts unbuckled and hanging loose, and Trevor moved carefully between them to examine the control panels, his camera recording every detail. The altitude indicator showed 38,000 feet, the last reading before whatever happened caused the aircraft to descend or transition or disappear from radar tracking. The fuel gauge indicated 42% remaining, enough for another hour and 20 minutes of flight time under normal conditions. The warning lights panel showed no active alerts, no emergency indicators, no signs that the crew had been dealing with mechanical failure or system malfunctions. Everything suggested a routine flight at cruise altitude with adequate fuel and no technical problems. And then something happened that left no record, no mayday call, no emergency beacon activation, just an intact aircraft sitting 1,247 feet underwater, with its passengers and crew vanished. Trevor noticed a yellow post-it note stuck to the edge of the control panel, the kind of small square paper that people used for quick reminders, and his light-illuminated handwriting in blue ink, slightly faded but completely legible. Letters formed in hurried script that read, "If you're reading this, turn back. Don't listen to the transmission." Cedar. The note was signed with 2 initials that Trevor couldn't decipher, and the paper itself showed water damage around the edges, but the adhesive still held it in place, still kept it attached to the panel where someone had deliberately placed it, someone who knew or suspected that this cockpit would eventually be found, someone who wanted to leave a warning for whoever came looking. Trevor photographed it from 3 angles, zoomed in on the handwriting, and felt his pulse accelerate, because this wasn't speculation anymore, this wasn't theory, this was direct evidence that the crew had experienced something they felt compelled to warn others about, something related to a transmission, something dangerous enough that they took the time to write a note even as their aircraft was in whatever crisis led to it ending up on the seafloor. He moved to the rear section of the cockpit, squeezing past the center console to access the area behind the seats where additional equipment and documentation were typically stored, and he located what he had come looking for, what Cassidy's $15,000 was really paying him to retrieve, even though she had never explicitly said so. The cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, a bright orange box approximately the size of a shoebox mounted in its protective housing near the rear bulkhead of the cockpit. It was designed to survive impacts up to 3,400 times the force of gravity, to withstand temperatures up to 1,100 degrees Celsius, and to remain functional in ocean depths up to 20,000 feet. And this one appeared completely intact, its mounting brackets secure, its NTSB seal unbroken, meaning no investigator had ever accessed the recording, meaning whatever conversations and sounds were captured on its solid-state memory had never been reviewed or analyzed or included in any official accident report. Trevor used a socket wrench from his kit to remove the 4 bolts securing the CVR to its mount, working slowly and carefully despite the pressure of limited air supply and necessary decompression time. And after 90 seconds, he held the device free, a 25-pound orange box that contained answers, that held the voices of pilots who had experienced something impossible, that represented evidence of whatever actually happened to this aircraft and its passengers. He placed the CVR into a hermetic bag designed for recovering sensitive equipment underwater, sealed it completely, and attached it to his equipment harness. His dive computer showed 93 minutes of elapsed time, well within safe limits, but approaching the threshold where decompression would become significantly longer and more complex. He needed to exit the aircraft, rejoin Quinn, and begin the ascent. He turned back toward the cockpit door, and his helmet lights flickered, a momentary dimming that lasted half a second before returning to full brightness, and Trevor checked his battery indicator, seeing it at 62%, when it should have been at 84% based on time and usage, a discrepancy that made no technical sense unless something was draining power faster than the specifications allowed. Quinn's voice burst through the underwater radio, urgent but controlled, the voice of someone who had seen something and was fighting to stay professional. "Trevor, we need to leave, now. Something's moving near the wreckage. I can't get a clear visual, but it's big, and it's getting closer." Trevor didn't ask questions, didn't request clarification, just acknowledged and moved toward the exit, pulling himself through the cabin with long, efficient strokes, not panicking but not delaying, reaching the emergency door and squeezing through the opening back into open water where Quinn was positioned 30 feet from the fuselage, lights pointed away from the aircraft into the darkness beyond, and Trevor joined him, both divers beginning their ascent without looking back, without trying to identify what Quinn had seen, just following training and protocol, and the basic survival instinct that said, when something unknown approaches in deep water, you don't investigate, you leave. The ascent took 3 hours and 15 minutes, following decompression protocols that Trevor had calculated on his wrist computer the moment they left the wreckage, staged stops at specific depths to allow nitrogen to safely leave their bloodstream, prevent the bending, prevent embolisms, prevent any of the dozen ways that rushing a deep dive could kill you or leave you permanently damaged. They didn't speak during the climb except for the mandatory safety checks every 20 minutes, confirming air supply and physical status, and Trevor could feel the weight of the CVR in his equipment bag, could feel the significance of what they had found pressing against his thoughts, even as he forced himself to focus on breathing rhythms and depth gauges, and the mathematical certainty of decompression tables that had been proven through decades of research and thousands of dives. Quinn stayed close, within visual range, and occasionally his lights would sweep the water below them, as if expecting to see whatever he had glimpsed near the wreckage following them upward. But the darkness remained empty, revealing nothing, offering no explanation for what had prompted their rapid exit. They broke the surface at 4:14 in the afternoon, exactly on schedule according to Trevor's dive plan, and immediately noticed that the small research vessel they had left 3.5 hours earlier was gone, replaced by a ship nearly 3 times larger with a white hull and the distinctive markings of a NOAA research vessel, the kind of official government oceanographic platform that cost taxpayers $12 million and required congressional authorization to deploy. Trevor and Quinn exchanged looks through their masks, confusion mixed with immediate suspicion because they hadn't radioed anyone, hadn't activated emergency beacons, hadn't done anything that would alert authorities to their location. And yet, here was a federal research ship positioned exactly at their coordinates, as if it had been waiting, as if someone had known precisely where they would surface and when. A deck officer in NOAA uniform helped them aboard, professional and efficient, and before Trevor could even remove his rebreather, a man in his early 50s wearing khaki pants and a NOAA windbreaker approached, showing credentials that identified him as Dr. Marcus Webb, senior marine investigator, and his first words were not a question, but a statement. "We'll take the recording from here." Fututi. Trevor felt his jaw tighten, his training and his instinct both telling him this situation was wrong in ways he couldn't fully articulate yet. He kept his voice level and professional, the tone he had learned in the Navy when dealing with officers who outranked you, but didn't necessarily know more than you. "This is my footage, my contract. I was hired to document and deliver data to my client, not to surrender equipment to federal agents who showed up uninvited. Doctor." Webb's expression didn't change, didn't show anger or frustration, just a kind of patient certainty that suggested he was used to people resisting and had procedures for handling it. "Your client is no longer available for contact, Mr. Caldwell. The vessel she chartered left the area 90 minutes ago. Her phone number is disconnected. The company she claimed to represent has no record of her employment. But we can discuss this in more detail once you've had a chance to recover from your dive and review the terms of certain federal statutes regarding discovery of protected maritime sites." East. The implied threat was clear. The suggestion that Trevor's cooperation could be voluntary, or it could be compelled, and he calculated his options in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, calculated that fighting a federal agency with lawyers and jurisdiction and unlimited resources would destroy him financially, would consume the $15,000 he hadn't even been paid yet, would create problems that would definitely impact his custody case for Mia, and that cooperation now might preserve some leverage later. He made a decision that felt like compromise and strategy in equal measure. "I'll make you a copy of the CVR data in exchange for keeping my original camera footage and GPS logs. You get what you're looking for. I keep documentation that I fulfilled my contract. Doctor." Webb considered this for maybe 5 seconds and nodded once, and within 40 minutes, Trevor was watching a NOAA technical specialist connect the cockpit voice recorder to a portable decryption and extraction system that would normally require days of work in a proper laboratory, but apparently could be accelerated with the right equipment and authorization. The device completed its transfer at 5:27, and Dr. Webb suggested they listen to the recording together, a suggestion that felt mandatory despite the polite phrasing, and Trevor and Quinn joined him and another NOAA officer in the ship's conference room, a space that smelled like coffee and salt air, and the audio began playing through speakers that were too loud, filling the room with the preserved voices of people who had disappeared years ago. The recording started with routine cockpit sounds, the background hum of engines and electronics, and then a voice identified in the metadata as First Officer Blake Matthews speaking with calm professionalism. "Miami Center, this is Atlantic 549, flight level 380, reporting position as filed." A pause, and then his voice changed. Not panicked, but alert. The shift from routine to attention that pilots were trained to maintain even when situations became abnormal. "Stand by. We have something visual at 2 o'clock position." the sound of seat movement, someone leaning forward, and then a different voice, older, the captain, identified as Ellis Marchant. What in the world is that? Not showing on radar. Looks like a structure. In the sky. Another pause, longer this time, 8 seconds of silence except for breathing and the engine background. And then Blake's voice again, tighter, stress beginning to show. It's getting closer. Captain, what do we do? Ellis responded immediately, command voice, decisive. Maintain heading and altitude. Miami Center, Atlantic 549, requesting immediate vectors away from unknown traffic at our 2 o'clock. Range approximately 5 miles. No response from air traffic control. Static. Ellis tried again, more urgent. Miami Center, Atlantic 549, do you copy? The next sounds were alarms, multiple systems triggering simultaneously, and Blake's voice rose over them, controlled but strained. Altitude dropping. I'm not inputting this. Controls are not responding. Instruments showing conflicting data. Ellis's voice cut through, louder, projecting authority even as the situation spiraled. Miami Center, we have lost primary control systems. Repeat, we have lost all primary controls. Altitude decreasing through 375. Rate of descent 2,000 feet per minute. No engine failure indicated, but we are not controlling this aircraft. More alarms, more voices overlapping, and then Blake again, almost whispering, but the microphone caught it clearly. Captain, look at the passengers. A pause that lasted 4 seconds and felt like an eternity. Ellis, voice shaking for the first time. What happened to them? They were just... Blake, where did they go? Another pause, this one 6 seconds, filled only with ragged breathing and alarm tones. Blake again, barely audible. They're gone. All of them. I saw them 30 seconds ago. I looked back. They're not in their seats. Captain, 167 people don't just disappear. Ellis, louder now, fighting for control. Check the cabin. Use the camera. Maybe they moved to the rear. Sound of switches clicking, and then Blake's voice, defeated, terrified. Camera shows empty seats. Every seat. They're not anywhere on this plane. The recording continued, documenting the impossible, and Trevor felt his hands gripping the edge of the conference table as he listened to 2 professional pilots dealing with a situation that violated every principle of physics and aviation and basic reality. Ellis's voice came through again, steadier now, making decisions even in chaos. We're descending through flight level 280. Controls still not responding. Blake, I need you to write something down. Get a post-it from my bag. Sounds of movement, paper rustling. Write this. If you're reading this, turn back. Don't listen to the transmission. Blake's voice, confused. What transmission? Captain, I don't understand. Ellis, speaking slowly, deliberately. I heard something on frequency 121.5, civilian emergency band. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language. But I understood it. It was offering something, and I think I accepted. I think we all accepted. Write the note and stick it on the panel. If anyone finds us, maybe they'll listen. More silence, 9 seconds this time, and then Blake again. We're at flight level 150, still descending. Captain, the ocean is getting close. Are we going to hit the water? Ellis, voice calm now, resigned. I don't think we're going to hit anything. I think we're being taken somewhere, and I think the passengers are already there. We're just the delivery crew. Blake, barely audible. Delivery of what? Ellis, final words. Evidence or bait. or maybe both. Blake, if you can hear any transmission, any voice that isn't human, don't respond. Don't acknowledge. Don't accept anything they offer, because once you do, the recording cut to static, abrupt and complete. No fade out, no gradual degradation, just sound and then silence, as if someone had severed the connection with precision. The conference room remained silent for 11 seconds after the recording ended. 4 people processing what they had just heard, trying to reconcile the voices of professional pilots describing an impossible situation with the physical reality of an intact aircraft sitting on the sea floor, with no passengers and no explanation that fit within accepted physics or aviation accident investigation protocols. Doctor. Webb reached over and stopped the playback, then looked directly at Trevor with an expression that wasn't hostile, but wasn't friendly either. More like the face of someone doing an unpleasant job that had to be done regardless of personal feelings. We're going to need all of your equipment, Mr. Caldwell. Hard drives, camera footage, GPS logs, the ROV if it recorded anything, and both of your dive computers. This is a federal investigation into matters of national security, and your cooperation is not optional. Trevor started to object, started to mention contracts and rights, and the fact that he had been hired legally to do legal work, but Dr. Webb held up one hand. You and Mr. Chen will be transported to a facility in Key West for debriefing. Standard procedure. 72 hours maximum. You'll be compensated for your time and provided accommodation. Your families will be notified that you're assisting with a federal matter and will return shortly. They were separated within 30 minutes, Trevor in one cabin and Quinn in another, and by nightfall, they had been transferred via Coast Guard helicopter to a nondescript building near the Key West Naval Air Station, a facility that had no signs, no official markings, just a chain-link fence, and security cameras and rooms that looked like budget hotel accommodations, but with locks on the outside of the doors. The interrogations, because that's what they were regardless of what Dr. Webb called them, lasted 3 days. Different questioners, different approaches, but the same core questions repeated in various forms. Did you hear any unusual transmissions during the dive? Did your radio equipment pick up any signals that weren't from your partner? Did you experience any time distortions, memory gaps, or periods where you couldn't account for your actions? Did you notice any other vessels or aircraft in the area before or after the dive? Trevor answered truthfully. No to everything because nothing unusual had happened with their communications, nothing that he could identify as abnormal beyond the compass anomaly and the temperature fluctuation and Quinn's report of something moving near the wreckage, all of which he documented in written statements that were reviewed and copied and filed away by people who never gave their full names. On the 3rd day, a lawyer arrived, a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as representing the Department of Commerce, the parent agency of NOAA, and she presented Trevor and Quinn with identical documents, 18 pages of legal language that boiled down to a non-disclosure agreement backed by federal statute. The terms were clear. They could not discuss, describe, reference, or acknowledge anything related to the dive, the wreckage, the CVR recording, or any aspect of the investigation. Violation would result in criminal prosecution, carrying penalties of $250,000 in fines and up to 10 years in federal prison. They were given 1 hour to read the document and 30 minutes to sign it, or face immediate detention under material witness statutes until a judge could review the case, which the lawyer helpfully noted could take weeks or months depending on court schedules. Trevor read every page twice, understanding that he had no leverage, no resources to fight this, and that signing meant he could go home to Mia and continue his custody case and maybe salvage something from this disaster. He signed. Quinn signed. They were released that evening with vouchers for a hotel night in Key West and bus tickets back to Nassau, and neither of them spoke about what they had found because the weight of federal prosecution was real and immediate and not worth testing. 2 weeks later, back in Pensacola, and trying to return to normal life, Trevor couldn't stop thinking about the tail number he had photographed, the partial registration November 381 that had been visible on the aircraft's vertical stabilizer. He accessed the FAA's publicly available database of aircraft registrations, a resource that any civilian could search, and cross-referenced the partial number with Boeing 737 models and commercial airline operations. He found a match within 40 minutes. Flight Atlantic 549, tail number November 3815. Charlie, a Boeing 737-800 operated by Atlantic Airways on a route from Atlanta to Miami, disappeared on August 14, 2009, with 167 passengers and 6 crew members on board. The official investigation lasted 3 months, covering 12,000 square miles of ocean, and concluded that the aircraft had likely been destroyed by a tropical storm system that had moved through the area on the same day, with all aboard presumed dead and the wreckage presumed lost in deep water beyond recovery depth. The case was closed, families were compensated, and the aviation industry moved on to other accidents and other investigations. But Trevor remembered the interior of that cabin, remembered the laptop computer that was a model released in 2021, remembered the smartphone in seat 9A that was an iPhone 13 based on the camera configuration, remembered the magazine showing advertisements for products that hadn't existed in 2009. He remembered coffee cups that looked recently used, not corroded by 14 years of saltwater exposure, and overhead compartments with clothes that should have rotted away, but instead were merely damp and covered in light sediment. The aircraft he had entered was from 2009 based on registration, but the contents suggested it had been occupied in 2023, suggesting a time discrepancy that violated every known principle of causality and linear time, suggesting that whatever Captain Ellis Marchant had meant when he said, "We're being taken somewhere," involved not just space, but temporal displacement, or replacement, or some mechanism that allowed objects and people to be moved across years as easily as across miles. Trevor began researching dive forums and maritime salvage message boards using careful language that wouldn't violate his NDA, searching for any mention of similar discoveries, any hints that other divers had encountered impossible wrecks or anomalies in the Bermuda Triangle region. He found fragments of information, deleted posts archived by web scrapers, references to a technical diver named Garrett who had written extensively about deep wreck surveys between 2015 and 2017 before his posts stopped abruptly. Trevor tracked down one archived forum thread where Garrett had written in July 2017, using language that seemed deliberately vague. Returned to coordinates I surveyed last year. Same numbers. Different result. What wasn't there is there now. Pattern suggests placement, not natural settling. Someone is using these as markers or bait. The post had been deleted within hours according to the archive metadata, and Garrett's user account had been suspended by forum administrators. Trevor found a news article from 2018 reporting that a technical diving instructor named Garrett Michael Chen from Fort Lauderdale had been reported missing by his family after failing to return from a solo dive trip to the Bahamas. No body recovered. Case remains open. Trevor kept a backup copy of his camera footage and GPS logs hidden in 3 separate locations, including a safety deposit box at a bank in Mobile, Alabama, far enough from his home that no obvious connection existed, but close enough that he could access it if needed. He never contacted Cassidy Romano again, and her phone number remained disconnected, the company she claimed to represent having no website, no business registration, no evidence it ever existed beyond the contract Trevor had signed, and the $15,000 deposit that was never paid into his account. The coordinates where they found the wreckage were reclassified in April 2023 as a military-restricted area, 5 nautical miles radius, no civilian vessels permitted without special authorization from the Department of Defense. But Trevor spoke with local fishermen who worked the Bahamas waters, men who knew the ocean currents and government patterns, and they reported seeing NOAA research vessels returning to that same area every 18 to 24 months, staying for exactly 72 hours, deploying ROVs and conducting operations that were never explained, and then departing without comment or press releases or any public acknowledgement of what they were doing. Trevor thinks about it every time he takes Mia to therapy, every time he signs another custody document, every time he plans a dive for offshore work, and has to check restricted area maps to ensure he's not accidentally entering zones that were open water just months before. He thinks about Captain Ellis Marchant's final words, about accepting an invitation, about passengers being taken and pilots being left behind as delivery crew, about being used as evidence or bait or both. He thinks about a transmission on frequency 121.5 that offered something without using human language but was somehow universally understood, and he thinks about Garrett's deleted post suggesting that whatever is happening in those coordinates is recurring, is intentional, is controlled by intelligence that places wrecks like pins on a map and waits to see who finds them. The question that keeps Trevor awake at night, the question that he knows he can never ask officially without violating his NDA and destroying his future, is simple and terrifying. If an aircraft from 2009 contained objects from 2023, and the pilots said they accepted an invitation before their passengers disappeared, who controls the invitation now? And why do they keep returning the wreckage to the same coordinates over and over, as if testing human curiosity, as if measuring who responds and how quickly they come, as if the dive itself is the real experiment and the wreckage is merely the lure?